Okay, I think it's time to get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Cliff Lynch, the director of CNI, and you found your way to the CNI virtual Spring 2020 meeting. We're now moving towards the end of the second week of the meeting. And today we have a project briefing on the persistence of persistent identifiers on the scholarly web. This is work that Martin Klein has been doing with his team at the Los Alamos National Labs, and it's part of a series of studies that he has been doing around the properties of the scholarly web and identifiers and the stability of these things over time. Martin will be talking and he will take questions at the end. You can put in questions at any time using either the chat or the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. When he's done, Diane Goldenberg-Hart from CNI will be moderating the Q&A part of the session. So with that, Martin, welcome. Thank you for doing this, and over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Cliff, for this kind introduction, and thank you to CNI for making this happen. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate you being here and joining me in this session today. As Cliff mentioned, my name is Martin Klein. I work at Los Alamos National Laboratory in the research library there. And what I would like to do today is, in this session, is give you a brief overview of our series of experiments on the persistence of persistent identifiers on the scholarly web. In particular, we're testing digital object identifiers, or DOIs, and how consistently or inconsistently scholarly publishers respond when DOIs are requested. So before I start, I'd like to refer you to our preprint that my colleague Luda and I recently published for more information about the topic, for more background information, for more details on the methodology and the data set that we generated and the methodology we applied, and also for more results of these experiments that I'm able to show today. So please feel free to check out this preprint for further information on the topic. So to motivate our work, I would like you to imagine 3 different scenarios for yourself. The first one is you find yourself in a park, like the one visualized or displayed here. You find yourself in a park. Unfortunately, you fell and you broke your leg. So you find yourself in an emergency situation. However, you're lucky in a way that you have your iPhone on you, you're not out of battery, and you're within cell phone reception. So you actually can call an emergency service, 911 in this case, and you do that. This friendly fellow answers your call and responds to your request in a very professional manner so that you eventually will be able to receive the help that you requested and the proper help that you need. So that's a great, given the circumstances, a great outcome of that scenario. Secondly, please join me in imagining that you're in your office, a different environment. However, you again tripped over a wire, let's say, you unfortunately broke your leg, but you can make it to your office phone that looks like this, and you're again able to call the emergency hotline. You call 911 to ask for help. However, this time around, this guy responds, and that's obviously a different sort of response, certainly less professional, and as a result of that, some sort of help is initiated, though probably not the help that you need, right? What are you supposed to do with that thing when you have a broken leg? So the third scenario, please imagine you're at home. So yet a different environment, and you find yourself in the very same emergency case, and you can access your landline. Yes, you probably missed a few upgrades over the years. Regardless, you are able to call 911. However, now in this case, no one is picking up your call, no one is responding to your call, and consequently, there is no help coming for your case. So now you may ask, well, so why am I asking you to imagine these scenarios? Well, wouldn't you think that regardless of the location that you're at, or the phone used, when calling a well-known number that uniquely identifies an emergency resource, like 911, would you not expect to get the same response? Or in other words, do you trust, and if so, why, do you trust the persistence of that number and the corresponding response? So what does that have to do with scholarly communication and persistent identifiers? Well, we can apply these scenarios to digital object identifiers, so DOIs, in a way that if you imagine phones being web clients, locations being network environments, and 911 calls representing HTTP requests against DOIs. So I can rephrase the question asked on the previous slide in this context now and ask, regardless of the web client and network location, would you not expect the same response from a web server when requesting the same DOI? So this led us to our study, where we're conducting a comparative investigation, basically, of scholarly publishers' responses when requesting DOIs with very common HTTP requests. We use different web clients and different request methods in our experiments, and those methods resemble, on the one hand, machines browsing, or if you will, crawling the web, and on the other hand, more humans browsing the web. We also conduct our experiments from two different network environments. On the one hand, the Amazon Cloud and AWS instance, and on the other hand, the Los Alamos National Laboratory internal network. So as you can imagine, these two networks have very different levels of subscription or license agreements with commercial publishers. So our intention here is to test the consistency of DOI responses. Because after all, without a level of consistency, how can we trust the persistence of such identifiers? All right, so how does this work? Well, we all know what this is. This is the DOI. And if I paste this DOI into my browser tells me it's negative 88,579. So this is not how it works, but we can make those DOIs actionable on the web via HTTP. And if I paste this actionable DOI into my browser, I eventually get the resource that I expect. However, behind the scenes sort of thing, somewhat opaque to the user, there's more to this DOI resolution process. Right? If I dereference this DOI, there's actually an HTTP redirect happening to a different resource, in this case, hosted by Springer, which is the publisher of this resource. So, but this is not actually the end of the redirect chain. Springer establishes another redirect to yet a different resource within Springer, because they figure out there's now HTTPS. We should probably serve our content over that via that means. However, there's also another resource that we can redirect to. So you see there's an entire redirect chain involved in dereferencing the single DOI, two out of which in this case are on the end of the publisher, on the end of Springer. So an entire redirect chain per DOI. So now we ask ourselves the question, how do we assemble a corpus of DOIs that is somewhat representative of the scholarly communication landscape? And you will probably believe me when I say this is not trivial. And in the interest of time, I won't go into details of how we did that. For now, it should suffice to say we assembled a corpus of 10,000 DOIs that we believe are somewhat representative of the overall scholarly communication landscape. And I refer to the preprint mentioned earlier for details of how we generated this corpus. So we have 10,000 DOIs that we can dereference. How, with what methods and clients do we dereference them? Well, we have 4 methods. And the first one is an HTTP head request. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a lightweight sort of a ping against the web server. Hey, is there something there? To which the web server responds with response headers only. The web server does not respond with a response body against this sort of a request. Right? We utilize the popular command line tool curl to send this sort of a request. And I visualized an example of how a curl request, a head request against the DOI would look like. In this case, we have a redirect chain, actually I have only 2 links, where the first link in the redirect chain redirects with a 302, with the response code 302 highlighted here, to another a resource that eventually returns a response code 200, meaning OK, and this is the end of the redirect chain. That sort of a request most closely resembles a machine browsing, or if you will, crawling the web, right? I would argue that only very geeky humans would ever send those requests on a regular basis. So the second request that we're sending, we again use our command line tool curl, but we send a get request. And the difference here is that the server responds with the response body as well as the response headers. And I've visualized this example here in a very simplified manner, indicating the response body being returned as well. That also is a request that very closely resembles a machine crawling the web. There are not a lot of humans that send these requests on a regular basis. Right? Our third request is an enhancement to the second one, actually. It's again a get request. It's again with curl, but we do enhance our request with a number of optional parameters. For example, saying that who we are in terms of conveying a user agent, we accept cookies, and so on and so forth. So that is a little bit of a hybrid between the two, but it still more closely resembles a machine crawling the web than it does a human. And last but not least, our fourth method is using the popular browser, web browser Chrome, and we can use that browser at scale by remote controlling it basically with a Selenium WebDriver. And since this is a real full-fledged browser, this dereferencing of DOIs very closely resembles humans browsing the web, right? So as a bit of a side comment, the document that standardizes or describes the ins and outs of HTTP, RFC 7231, states that a server should, so a very strong suggestion, should send the same response headers regardless of whether the request is a head or whether the request method is a get, right? So regardless of what we send, we should expect the same response headers. And as you've seen in the previous examples, part of those response headers is the response code, 200, 300, and so on and so forth. And just as a reminder for everyone, there are a number of response headers, response codes that we can observe. The 200 level response codes indicate success of the HTTP transaction. 300 level indicates some sort of redirection. So there will be another link to be followed. The 400 level response code indicates some sort of an error happening on the client side, and the 500 level response code indicates an error on the server side. So let's start and look at some results of our experiments. This visualization shows the results of our 4 methods dereferencing all 10,000 DOIs. We follow the entire redirect chain per DOI and record the individual links of that redirect chain, and visualize here the response codes of all final links of those individual redirect chains, right? So note that this is the experiment as conducted from an Amazon cloud instance. So this is our EC2 AWS instance, so the external network, if you will. Our 4 methods are visualized on the x-axis, and the 10,000 DOIs visualized on the y-axis, and the individual colors convey the HTTP response code level. So green indicates a 200 level response, gray indicates a 300 level response, so redirect, red 400, and blue 500. I don't believe we have an error in this graph. So there are several different observations that we can immediately make from a visualization like this. The first one being that less than 50% of all our DOIs return a 200 level, so success, response across all 4 request methods. That in and by itself is a very sad statement, Because the other way around, right? More than 5,000 of our DOIs do not respond consistently to all 4 methods. That is worrisome. The second observation we can make is a significant portion of DOIs that do not respond well when the simple get method is used. 300 level responses should not be the final response code of the redirect chain, right? Because by definition, a redirect indicates that there's something else to follow too. There's more than 40% of those DOIs respond to that level of response code for simple get methods. We have no obvious explanation for that, especially given the next observation that a significant portion of those DOIs return a 200 level response code when the head or the Chrome method are used. So that doesn't make any sense to us. We don't have an obvious explanation for this sort of a finding. And the last observation that I want to make on this graph is we have a good chunk of a good portion of DOIs returning a 400 level response on the head method when the head method is used. And now if you're familiar with HTTP, you may say, well, this could be a whole bunch of 403 response codes indicating that we don't have the rights to access this resource, that the access is actually forbidden, but that's not the case. You may also say, well, this could be a whole bunch of 405s indicating that this method head is not allowed on that resource. And that is also not the case. We double checked, and this portion really is dominated by the response code 404, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with that response code, meaning the resource is not there, which is interesting, especially interesting given that a chunk of those DOIs return a 200 level response when other request methods are used. So what is going on here? Do these resources exist? Do they not exist? Are these Schrodinger's resources, right? It is odd at the very least. However, all these observations that I just went through, and including the changing response codes for when different request methods are used, strongly indicate that scholarly publishers indeed respond very differently to requests against the same DOI, depending on what method is used. We do see differences between responses when the request method resembles more machine behavior on the web versus a human behavior on the web. Right? Because you can clearly see, if you compare all four methods, that the Chrome method, the one that resembles a human browsing behavior on the web the closest, clearly performs best in terms of most amount of 200 level responses for requests. So if I now compare this set of experiment or this set of results from the external network with repeating the same experiment on the internal network, we can have these graphs basically side by side. On the right-hand side now are depicted the results from the very same experiment repeated from within the LANL network. And a couple of things are immediately striking. First of all, the ratio of DOIs that consistently return a successful response have increased to almost 2/3. So more than almost 67% of DOIs return 200 level responses across the board. That's a significant higher percentage than from the external network. Chrome as a request method or as a browser used as a human behavior resembling method is performing even better in this case. And we still, however, see a lot of oddities, let's say, right? A lot of 400 level responses, actually more 500 level responses, and the same or similar fraction of magic resources that change response codes when other request methods are used. So I believe there's still a good chunk of DOIs that display a behavior that is worrisome in our context here. So then now we have a comparison between the internal and the external network. Now we ask ourselves, could there be a difference between resources that are open access versus resources that are not open access? So we looked at our external experiment here on the left-hand side and ran all these DOIs against the unpaywall API in order to identify DOIs that in turn identify open access resources versus those that don't. So the fraction of DOIs for open access resources are depicted here in the center and for non-open access on the far right. And in comparison, the overall results for the external network is depicted on the left. I'd like to stress, however, that the fraction of DOIs that identify open access resources is fairly small, right? Just under 1,000 DOIs fall in this category, as you can see in the center graph. So it's a very small data set. I would propose to repeat this set of experiments with a larger data set in order to increase our confidence, let's say, for these sort of findings. However, I do believe we can see a couple of patterns emerging potentially, right? First of all, the fraction of DOIs that return 200 level responses across the board is higher for open access content, slightly, but still higher. There is still this oddity of simple GET requests and actually enhanced GET requests as well, that they get stuck, it seems, with 300 level responses for open access content. We can see, again, with the caveat that there are many more DOIs in this fraction, but we can see that all the a lot of the non-successful responses, the 400 and 500 level responses, stem from the right hand, from the graph shown on the far right here, from the non-open access content, and also all the a lot of the oddities, right? The DOIs that return a 400 level response for a head request and a 200 level or a different level response for all other requests seem to be stemming from that category of DOIs. So the last set of experiments I'd like to get into is trying to address our question, how does this scenario change if we look at content that we, as Los Alamos National Laboratory, have subscription rights or license agreements for a bit, right? So here we identified DOIs that in turn identify content for which we have subscription rights or license agreements, so we can access those, versus DOIs that identify content for which we do not have the right to access, depicted on the far right again. Similar caveat here as well, that the number of DOIs is not evenly distributed, let's say, and it's a very small data set with only 1,266 DOIs identifying content that we have subscription rights for. So I would like to generate a larger corpus to increase our confidence here. But the numbers, just by looking at them, the first impression that we get is kind of stunning in a way that, again, a significant portion, significantly larger portion of DOIs return a 200 level response across the board for content that we have subscription rights to. But the question still remains, what happens to the other 16%, right? In theory, this should be a graph that's entirely green on this context. As we can see, it is almost entirely green for the Chrome method, but the other three methods leave some problems to be analyzed and explained, let's say. Similar to the previous graph you've seen, a good chunk of the non-successful responses seem to be stemming from content that we do not have access rights to. So what does this mean? How can we sum this topic up, and how can we try to move forward? I think we have shown solid indicators that scholarly publishers indeed frequently respond inconsistently to different requests against the same DOI. The responses rather, seem to be depending on the HTTP client used, on the HTTP request method used, and also on the network environment from which these requests are made. So what are the implications here for the persistence, or maybe the perceived persistence of our DOIs? Well, I would argue that the level of inconsistency for DOI resolution surely does not build trust in our DOIs and our DOI infrastructure. And remember that this is the end of the redirect chain that is on the publisher side. I would also argue that the lack of adherence to standards does not build trust. So here I'm referring to the changing of response codes from one method to another. In one method, it shows you that the resource is 404, with another method, it shows, oh, here it is, 200. That does not make me build trust in our infrastructure. As indicated, obviously more work is needed in this realm, but it seems to be that initial findings indicate DOIs that identify open access content show a little bit more consistency than those that identify non-open access content. And the same seems to hold true for DOIs that identify content that our institution has a license agreement with. I would like to, of course, repeat those sort of experiments in different institutional setups to see whether that is a reproducible pattern or whether, for some reason, this is an outlier. On the more technical level of implications of these sort of findings, especially for, let's say, archival efforts of libraries and archives, what does that mean? Well, my recommendation would be for developers there to test as many combinations of request methods and clients and also network environments as possible, because we've seen that the responses are not consistent, and we need to find a way, unfortunately, that works best for our use cases. Right? However, it seems to be, generically speaking, true that if you can make your network crawling environment to appear as human as possible, the odds of succeeding in terms of receiving the most amount of 200 level responses seems to be best. So with this, I'd like to stop now. And again, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for being here. I would love your feedback on these findings. I would love to see people reproducing these sort of experiments in other network environments. I'd be happy to have a discussion about any and all that we talked about. And for that, I believe I hand it over to Diane.
Wow, thanks, Martin. That was very interesting and disconcerting, to say the least. I see that we already have a question for you that comes from Rob Sanderson. Rob says, hello, hi, Martin. Fascinating research. Did you consider the intersection of non-subscribed, non-OA 400 or 500 responses to see what proportion are permission-based, perhaps still reporting incorrectly 404, rather than other cases? These could be considered to successfully resolve to an error due to the paywall?
Yeah, that's a good question, Rob. Thanks for that. The short answer is no. We have not. We've not done any sort of intersection or cross-section analysis of how these let's say levels of access, right? We've purposefully kept it simple for now and kept the analysis of OA versus non-OA for the external experiment and the subscription versus non-subscription rights for the internal experiment. But I absolutely agree this would be a very relevant and interesting experiment. I would also like to again, increase the data set to build our confidence on that. I'm honestly not sure whether the 10% of DOIs is somewhat representative to OA versus non-OA content. But recently we've seen that Crossref has made available an entire dump of their DOI data. So now we have a corpus that can be argued to be somewhat representative. So that would be another way of getting more DOIs and trying to experiment with those.
Okay, thanks, Martin, and thanks, Rob, for that question. And we have another question that's come in from Robin Rugaber, who asks, did you investigate the redirects to see if there was something valid? We have a situation with the legacy archival content. With legacy archival content. If we were to assign persistent IDs, we would need to crosswalk between the DOI and the repo ID.
So I'm not sure I'm following your use case there, Robin, but I believe part of the answer is no, we have not done a more closely investigation to the individual links of those redirect chains. Right? We've basically just for now looked at the individual response codes and focused in particular on the response code of the last link of each redirect chain. It is still subject to future work, and it's on our plates now to more closely look at how these redirect chains are made up, really, how they maybe evolve over time, and what the differences are, basically what the path is to the resource, right, depending on the clients used, on the environments that you're in. So a more close investigation of how these redirect chains are built is up for future work. And another aspect of that is the notion of what are these resources actually like, right? Did we really land on the, let's say, the landing page, for example, that we expect to land on, or is are these what's known as soft 404s? So the response code actually says 200, but on the page a human can read, sorry, we don't have that. Those sort of scenarios are still on our plate. This is something we have not looked into. But a very interesting part of that experiment for sure.
All right, so Robin says that she will email you on the use case, but thanks for going into the redirect further. So thanks for that, Martin.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Looks like we have another question from Stefano. What is the reasoning behind pretending to be human for a higher success rate when testing? I would think that consistency of responses is more important than success rate, but maybe you're looking at different end goals?
Yeah, that's a good question, Stefano. Thank you for that. I would say it really depends on your use case, right? If you're in the business of maintaining an archival crawler, like let's say Logs, for example, is, I would probably make the case that you would try to optimize your environment for success. If you're trying to, build a quantitative or comparative study similar to what we did, you probably want to highlight all the oddities and all the cases where things went wrong, and then try to analyze of how they went wrong. So I think our perspective here was we're trying to put numbers on those observed oddities in order to inform people that this is not a no-brainer, right? This is not, it's not the case that you can just send a simple request and expect the same sort of answer compared to a more complex HTTP request. And everyone that has done some sort of web crawling in the past will know that, will have observed that. I was fed up with it, honestly, which motivated us to put numbers on it and publish these numbers to really outline this is not normal. This is not an environment where we can trust on having found the panacea for persistent identifiers, right? If we're treating our infrastructure the way we do, this does not build trust, and that was really the whole point. But your distinction is very well taken. I absolutely agree.
Interesting. All right, thanks, Martin. And we can probably take one more question if anybody would like to ask another one before we close the webinar. While we're waiting to see if there are other questions, I just want to remind everyone that you have joined a webinar that is part of CNI's Spring 2020 virtual spring meeting, and we're really happy that you were able to make time to come and hear Martin's interesting chat today. I'm just pasting into the chat box the direct URL to our schedule for the rest of the meeting. So there's plenty more to come. We'll be having live streaming webinars throughout the rest of April and throughout the month of May as well. So there's plenty more to come. Our next webinar, live webinar, will be next week on Tuesday, April 21st. We'll be having a talk on revising the Vivo ontology, and a couple more that same day. Our first session on our recent call for proposals having to do with the COVID-19 crisis, event 201, why weren't we paying attention? And then also a session on Simply E, also on that same Tuesday, April 21st. So please join us for lots of great content to come. It looks like we don't have any more questions, so I'm seeing folks chat in. Thanks so much, Martin. It was really enlightening, and I think I can hear the applause from a distance there. Thanks to everyone who joined us. And Martin, thank you so much for coming to CNI and sharing the results of your work with us today. I'm sure we'll look forward to some updates to the research you have yet to come.
For sure. Thank you so much for making this happen. This was really fun. Thank you for being here, everyone, and thanks for listening in. Thank
you so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone, or wherever you are in your time zone. And we hope to see you back again soon. Be well. Bye-bye.